For those who regularly tune in to Washington Watch, you'll know that we have been sounding the alarm on a dangerous international agreement. It's really a treaty, but the term has been changed to try to avoid having to go through the Senate. And this would give the World Health Organization, the WHO, greater control over the way the U.S. responds to global health pandemics like COVID-19. And it's not just America, it's every country. I mean, this is a global power grab. Well, Americans have less than 2 weeks to weigh in with the Biden administration on their plan to adopt this agreement. Now, there is a comment period that has opened up to allow Americans to respond. Now, we're doing everything we can through Congress to kill this deal, but it would be helpful to have you weigh in as well. If you want to help us raise the alarm for others, there's a detailed article on the Washington Stand that goes over everything you need to know about this agreement. Here to unpack that for us right now is Ben Johnson, senior reporter and editor at the Washington Stand, who put together this explainer of the WHO in this latest power grab. Ben, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Pleasure to be with you, Tony.
So, Ben, let's go over some of the biggest concerns of this treaty or agreement, as it's being called, that's being pushed by the World Health Organization.
Well, sure. The WHO pandemic agreement threatens national sovereignty and it hands control over certain aspects of how we respond to a global pandemic over to the World Health Organization. For example, the WHO considers abortion essential care during a pandemic. The treaty also mentions gender diversity, and WHO is formulating new guidelines on transgender procedures next month, so that could impact things. The most disturbing part of this agreement, though, from a Christian point of view, is that it codifies a doctrine that it calls One Health. That equates the health of humans with animals and ecosystems. It uses the word balance, but essentially it means it flattens our view of human dignity down to that of animals and plants. There is no aspect that is more important than another. Dr. Anthony Fauci has actually written a lot about this. He wrote in one of his articles that living in harmony with nature will take, and I quote, radical changes that may take decades to achieve, rebuilding the infrastructures of human existence. He's also particularly worried about human population growth and freedom of movement. The agreement would ramp up government censorship or public-private partnership, which would try to censor what it calls an infodemic. But its definition of infodemic is, quote unquote, too much information. They were worried that people will have too much information, not just misinformation or disinformation. Each government would create a whole of society response to shutting down anything that reduces trust in government or trust in public officials. Of course, the primary thing that undermines trust in public officials is the statement of public health officials,
right.
Dr. Anthony Fauci's intellectual triple Lutz on whether masks work or not. Originally, they were useless. Then they were mandatory for everyone over the age of 2. Then they were not so helpful again. Or when Joe Biden promised, you're not going to get COVID if you get these vaccinations, when the CDC director said vaccinated people don't carry the virus, or when Dr. Fauci said that you become a dead end, you can't get sick and you can't transmit the virus to others if you get the COVID shot. So, of course, obviously the entire idea of silencing speech is profoundly anti-American. It's opposed to our First Amendment, and it assumes that the government is the repository of all truth and people should simply be still and know that Caesar is God.
So you've laid out a lot there, Ben. Let's unpack a couple of these items. One, and this is something we saw from our own administration, the Biden administration, during the COVID pandemic, is this effort to suppress speech and use social media to censor users if they were talking about the wrong information, not necessarily disinformation, just the wrong information they didn't want out there. This now would become basically the model for who they would applaud what the Biden administration did, which we see attorneys general fighting all the way up to the Supreme Court to put a halt to. The WHO under treaty would basically call for that worldwide.
It does. Article 18 of the WHO pandemic agreement particularly deals with this. Again, the entire document calls for a whole of society, whole of government response. It tells governments around the world they should invest in health communication, by which they mean essentially propaganda efforts. But also, you can censor public dissemination of this kind of thing. They also call for cramping down on what they call substandard treatments, which in the U.S. context, of course, we saw this during COVID. People who were using, for example, hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin or other procedures ended up being dismissed as quacks. There was a doctor, Dr. Mary Nass, who lost her license because of this, and just recently had that suspension continued up through next year.
So you got to march to the beat of their drum and their drum only. I don't want to leave this issue just yet of the misinformation and the silencing of voices. We saw this with the Great Barrington Declaration, where we saw Dr. Fauci and others in the establishment basically clamping down, using social media levers to silence anyone who questioned what they were doing. I find it very interesting, Ben, that next week, when the World Economic Forum meets again in Davos, they just recently, this releases, I just saw this today, their number one concern, the top 10 risk that they see. Do you know what the number one issue they see as a risk is? Misinformation and disinformation. So these are the folks that fund all of this, working in tandem. I mean, this is exactly what they want through the World Health Organization. The ability, you scare everybody with some kind of pandemic, and they'll willingly surrender, as we saw so quickly, their rights in order to be told that they would be safe, which now we know, for anyone who will read the studies and the results, that, as you pointed out, the masking, the vaccines, these things were not effective, as they said. But they'll use this fear that they create to grab more power. And number one is First Amendment freedoms that we enjoy here in the United States.
Well, that's right. We know that the administration had a backdoor channel through to multiple social media outlets. Twitter, of course, because of the Twitter files. Under its previous ownership, under Jack Dorsey, there was a backdoor portal where they could flag accounts, they could flag messages, either to be throttled or to have them essentially ghosted so that they would not appear in search results, or to completely ban certain accounts because they said something that the government felt was not what the message that they wanted promoted on social media. In many cases, the people that they censored ended up being right, and the people who did the censoring ended up being completely wrong. And ultimately, Dr. Fauci just this very week ended up admitting that most of the things that he had done during this pandemic didn't have a scientific basis. He didn't know how some of them got in, allegedly. So we saw all of the censorship, the disinformation that was promoted by people in our own government. This was before there was an international agreement encouraging them to do so. Right. So if this agreement passes, it's hard to imagine the kind of strictures on the First Amendment we would see.
This is what's so outrageous about this. 2 years after this, we can analyze, we can see the results and the failed approach. The WHO is not taking that into consideration. They're doubling down, and they want to cement what they did wrong into essentially a treaty binding all nations of the world to what was a flawed approach to a pandemic.
It's very much a product of its time. You know, in addition to reflecting the mindset of 2020 when it comes to pandemics, it also takes ideas like equity and places that at the very center of this. So there's calls for quotas. It talks about universal health care, for example, such as that which is promoted in the UK. In 2018, the British Red Cross said that the NHS had created a humanitarian crisis because of how poorly its national healthcare system was working.
Going back, we go back to your article. And by the way, folks, you can see this article at the Washington Stand. Just go to TonyPerkins.com and follow the links over. And if you're not already signed up to get the daily briefing from the Stand, I would encourage you to do that, so that you're getting information like this that you're not going to get anywhere else. Now, I also want to do this. I want to encourage you to sign this. We've got an alert that is out on WHO. You can find out more. Just text WHO to 67742. That's WHO to 67742, and you'll get a link. And you can tell your congressman and your senators to defund the World Health Organization, pull the plug on it. But I want to go back to this. This really gets me, Ben, because, I'm a big believer in the First Amendment. I mean, I've served in our nation's military to protect that fundamental freedom. I've served as a police officer and protected that freedom. Ghebreyesus, the Director General, is telling governments essentially to silence anyone who is critical of this agreement that's being put out there. He's saying you basically, these people are not telling the truth, so you need to silence them. I mean, that should tell us where this is headed. Even before it's signed, he's wanting governments to silence any critics of this agreement.
That's right. He has said that part of the disinformation he's seeking to combat is the idea that this treaty in any way restricts national sovereignty. In point of fact, if you read the very beginning of the document, one of the very first things it talks about is about national sovereignty. And it says the nations have national sovereignty, but this is a quote, according to Article 3, only in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations and the general principles of international law. So if you violate international law according to the WHO, and there's no appeals mechanism anywhere in this document, then you lose at least that portion of your national sovereignty. So he's promoting false news according to his own document, and yet he has explicitly called for all of the nations of the world to combat anyone who dares to point it out.
And before we run out of time, I want to go back to something else you mentioned about One Health, and this essentially this takes man and puts him on the same plane as plants and animals.
It truly does. When it's talking about One Health, again, they use the term balancing, but particularly what they say is that if we are harming the environment, and it makes explicit mention of quote unquote climate change in here, essentially this document is going to say that unless we combat climate change, unless we reduce chlorofluorocarbon emissions and carbon, et cetera, then we are going to undermine the health of mankind. By the way, the Biden administration tried to do something like this in its very early days. They tried to change the way that regulations were graded. They said that the cost of regulations would include not only the dollar cost, but also their impact on the environment. So they have tried to make this literally a whole of government approach to streamline, to mainline, to introduce the extreme left ideology of climate change and the green agenda into every part of government, including quote unquote human health.
That turns,
obviously, from a Christian perspective, that just violates
right.
It violates what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, that you are much better than these creatures.
I was just going to say that this turns biblical truth on its head. That man was created and placed on this earth. Earth was created for man, and we were to have dominion over it. We're not equal with it, nor it's not equal with us. I mean, this is our home. We want to take care of it, but we're not on the same plane.
That's right. This, as you say, we were created at the very end of creation. All of it was pronounced good, and yet only mankind was created in the image of likeness of God. And by the way, I would say that that's also part of the harm of this misinformation that you've been talking about so much, that we were created in the image and likeness of God. That means we have a rational mind. We have the ability to process information and come to conclusions on our own because we have that ability.
Right.
And for anyone to deny us that is simply to say, you're eternally a child.
And that's what they're doing here. And that's what our government has been doing. Ben Johnson, thanks so much for joining us. Great work on this piece.
Thank you so much.